Welcome to Parliament House in Canberra for a very special event being broadcast live on Sky News around the country. And this happens to be in one of the Senate committee rooms of Parliament House in Canberra. And literally below our feet right now is the Prime Minister and Treasurer's Economic and Productivity Roundtable. But basically because of the energetic efforts of Senator Matt Canavan, the National Senator, he decided to bring together a real roundtable about productivity. And so you'll hear from some of the leading experts in Australia, not only on our economy, but also on productivity today about what really needs to happen. This is quite different to the roundtable. It's taking place downstairs for a few reasons. Number one, it's being broadcast. Downstairs, there are no cameras. In fact, even in this room, there are mobile phones. Downstairs, there are no mobile phones. They are locked in. You don't know what's saying. So much for open government, you might argue, but really here you are going to find out exactly what needs to be done to get this country moving again. The real conversation is about productivity, probably stimulated because the Reserve Bank did not cut interest rates as quickly as the government might have wanted. And so as a result, all of a sudden, the word productivity became the top of everybody's minds. But the reality is there's a lot of other issues in Australia, competitiveness being one of those. Australia right now is seeing capital leaving this country simply because the country, it would seem, is not competitive enough. That means energy prices, that means taxes, that means industrial relations. A lot of things which even the roundtable downstairs does not dare to discuss. So we have, as I say, a really stellar group of people in this room today, but the person who brought everybody together is Senator Matt Canavan, and so I think it's appropriate that we start and hear from him first. Matt.
Thank you very much, Ross, and thank you for all coming along today at such short notice. Thank you very much for Sky for broadcasting this, because I do believe that the Australian people deserve a frank discussion about the economic hole our country is in and how we get out of it. And they deserve to hear how those problems have come about and what are the real solutions to it. We have some of the best and brightest economic minds in the country here today, business leaders. I want to thank you all for coming together at short notice. I had this idea just a week ago, and I was having breakfast with Gerard Holland there, and we were both lamenting the fact, after having read the papers for this roundtable, that there was barely a mention of some of the major issues facing our country. There was no mention of the tripling of electricity prices that have occurred in the past 20 years. There was no mention of the industrial relations morass that has caused our construction sector to find it so difficult now. And there's no mention of the government spending outbreak we've seen that is itself crowding out private investment. And so we had this idea and we called people, and I think a lot of people around the country are thinking that the government's Productivity Roundtable doesn't seem to be all that productive right now. And so thank you all for coming out. I want to particularly thank Gary Banks, the former chair of the Productivity Commission, for coming. I worked with Gary 20 years ago on a report into the last major economic reforms that we did as a country, the national competition policy reforms, and we had the job of assessing what the impact of those reforms were. It's hard to remember now, but back then I pulled out the report this morning, this report that we did. From 1990 to 2004, electricity prices fell by 19%. They actually fell. We actually got in there and made some hard decisions, and we took off. We lowered the cost of living for Australian people, and of course helped Australian businesses compete with the world. Of course, since then we've lost complete control of electricity prices, and when we assess the impact of those reforms, it was that reduction in electricity prices which generated the biggest benefits for consumer welfare. And so I think we've got to focus on those real issues. We've got to return to that discussion. We are not going to, in my view, fix our productivity crisis if we cannot lower energy prices in the country. It's as simple as that. But as I said, I'm hopeful for a frank and open discussion today. Unlike the secret roundtable downstairs, there are no restrictions on what people say. We're completely open to the public. My only rule is that could we please avoid any corporate gobbledygook? Can we just speak plainly? Because plainly, the economic conditions of this country are not good enough, and we're only going to get out of it by speaking plainly, honestly and frankly, and tackling these challenges before they get a lot worse. So thank you again, Ross, and thank you everybody again for being here. I really look forward to a great discussion today.
Right, thank you so much, Matt. I should have also mentioned right at the outset that Matt Canavan did work for the Productivity Commission, and so hence that might be the reason why perhaps one voice that has not been heard in all this conversation about productivity for a long, long time is Gary Banks, the former chair of the Productivity Commission, now the Dean and also the Chief Executive of ANZOG, the Australian New Zealand School of Government, and I think a lot of people will be wanting to hear his own views about the way in which Australia could improve what is a woeful decade of productivity growth, which has really led to the diminishing of people's, well-being, their lifestyle, and indeed perhaps their standard of living. Gary, welcome, and we'll go to you next.
Thanks very much, Ross. I should say that I'm no longer with ANZOG. For a long time, people were saying, "Are you retired?" I didn't know what to say, but I think I can say now, yes, I am. But it's a bit like Groundhog Day coming back into this committee room with a few more cameras maybe than the last time I was here. Well, I mean, as the Productivity Commission still keeps reminding us, productivity growth's accounted for at least 80% of the increase in per capita income in Australia since the mid-century. And it'll need to be the main determinant, obviously, of future living standards as well. And that productivity has essentially gone from nowhere for much of this new century, has become a matter of general concern, if not consternation. Even more concerning, I think, is the expectation, which is embedded in the Treasury's latest intergenerational report, of a much diminished future rate of productivity growth compared to what it was in the past. And the Reserve Bank has, in rather loud terms, just underlined that for us all. And of course, that'll bring with it a comparable diminution in income growth and thus living standards in the longer term. We may be looking forward to or looking backward in a way to a future generation which is less well off than its parents, and that may be happening right now. So the challenge we face is that the conditions for sustained improvement don't exist, despite government narratives to the contrary. A lot of public policy, and indeed much so-called reform, is working against the productivity objective, and increasingly so. And in broad terms, policies that promote cost-conscious and innovative behaviour, that enhance access to human capital, efficient infrastructure services, and inhibit better performing enterprises prevailing over weaker ones, all of those could be called pro-productivity, and those having the opposite effects are anti-productivity. Now, many of the latter, as you'd all know, involve regulations that either distort business decisions, that raise risks, that stifle innovation, or that involve undue costs. Those influences also tend to inhibit private investment, which again, as you know, is a key transmission mechanism, for productivity itself. So, sorry, let me just... I had one of those mornings where my actual notes disappeared and I'm relying on my iPad to back me up. Well, unfortunately, any attention to regulation has been more about increasing it, I think, than reducing it or improving it. And the government's productivity agenda is mainly a spending agenda, and indeed you could say a spending more agenda. It's not one that involves, or has to date anyway, the kind of regulatory reforms that are needed. Now, energy and labour markets, two areas of crucial importance to Australia's economic performance, have been particular casualties of so-called reform. In the case of energy, which we're going to hear a lot more about in the next session, rather than leveraging the power of markets to discover least cost means of reducing emissions Australia-wide, governments have opted for ad hoc subsidies and regulatory measures without regard for their widely differing costs and significant distortionary effects on resource allocation. They've adopted targets for emissions and renewables without any clear idea of how to achieve them. And in so doing, they've assisted technologies that cannot deliver reliable power while suppressing those that could. Now, the result's an increasingly dysfunctional energy system requiring far more capital to produce far less reliable power. It's the antithesis of the pro-productivity policy governments persist in presenting it as. Now, abundant low-cost energy has traditionally played an important role, as Matt was implying, in offsetting the detrimental impact on industry performance of Australia's rigid, high-cost labour market. Not only is it no longer possible for energy to play this role, after a period of greater flexibility that began with the Hawke-Keating-Kelty reforms, regulatory impediments in the workplace have also been increasing again. For example, on top of existing anti-productivity provisions, legislative provisions to restore industry-wide bargaining and to control non-permanent, read non-unionised, work arrangements will diminish the scope for the win-win enterprise deals that are needed and see more production decision-making being influenced by the regulator. This will inhibit innovation, job creation and growth. Yet, of course, as we know, workplace regulation is not being discussed on the floor below, despite Treasury's previously expressed concern about the effect of restrictive labour market regulation on the dynamism that they see as the key to productivity growth. A third area where government policy has gone backwards with respect to economic efficiency and productivity is taxation. There are too many taxes, too many of which harm productive endeavour, incentives reduced, capability diminished, and human and capital resources are diverted to less productive uses or indeed overseas. Reforms that would improve things, including by reducing what Paul Keating's described as the punitive taxation of income, have been laid out in various reports over the years. But, and including, of course, a whole day tomorrow in the round table, the government's round table in the other room. But reducing the pressure on the taxation system by trimming public expenditure itself is rarely mentioned. Yet the potential gains from lower deadweight costs of taxation and more efficient service provision are considerable. The diversion of resources to the public sector has been a major contributor to the decline in productivity growth in Australia, and you'll have all seen the same reports that I've seen about that. Now, most parts of the public sector not only have lower productivity, but they have inherently slower productivity growth. And this reflects not just greater labour intensity of the services concerned, but weaker incentives to use resources in a cost-effective way and to pursue cost-reducing innovations. Yet a key strand of the government's productivity agenda is to further promote the scale and reach of the burgeoning care economy, so-called. In reality, of course, this will do little for national productivity. In fact, it'll diminish it. What it will do, of course, is increase the number of people employed in the non-market economy. And again, you'll see the numbers on that, which are staggering, the high proportion of total job creation that's being created with taxpayers' money. Public sector waste and the loss of economy-wide growth potential associated with it are, of course, not confined to the caring sector. Indeed, the term white elephant these days is synonymous with big publicly financed infrastructure projects that, as a first approximation, never come in on time or on budget. Such projects, and there are plenty of them, do not just waste resources, they crowd out other projects in both the private and the public sectors, projects that could bring benefits to society. Victoria's big build, I live in Melbourne these days, has drained resources otherwise available to Victoria's building and construction sector, for example, at a time of hugely unmet demand for housing. When it comes to large-scale private projects, a range of regulatory obstacles are candidates for reform. A recent Productivity Commission report has laid them out at length, but there's been little or no progress in ameliorating them. Well, in view of all this, it's perhaps unsurprising that productivity has gone from sluggish to depressive, and investment with it. and that some key businesses have moved offshore, and indeed insolvencies are historically high. The impacts of higher costs and reduced labour market flexibility on competitiveness are likely to be particularly damaging for manufacturing. It's therefore a bit ironic that, having ignored or added to such impediments, the government is embarking on a future made in Australia pitch for Australia to become a leader in green manufacturing. Even more ironic is the recognition that this could only be achieved with substantial subsidies from the taxpayer. Now, to someone who spent much of his career at the Productivity Commission and its predecessors, the sense of déjà vu is palpable. What did Yogi Berra say? Déjà vu all over again. Well, I guess the typical experience from the past has been that the risk of government sponsoring businesses will never be internationally competitive, and creating a long-term dependency on public support at significant cost to the wider community. I think it was George Santayana who remarked on the perils of not heeding the lessons of history. Seeking to obtain benefits to society through subsidies for particular firms or industries, including in the form of tax concession, has proven a fool's errand, a term for which I got into a little bit of trouble with the Prime Minister the last time I said it. But this is particularly true where the competitive fundamentals are lacking. Now, while it's asserted that this time the government's approach will be, quote, more nuanced and disciplined, the basis for that is unclear, to say the least. None of the schemes appear to have had the benefit of the sort of evidence-based approach they need. Just declaring that an initiative is in the national interest does not make it so. And I'll end there. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. I mean, we'll have discussion about this very shortly because there's so many issues that Gary has raised there which really go to the heart of the issues that the Australian economy genuinely has right now. But in order to basically pay for some of the measures that the government has implemented, the NDIS being one, childcare subsidies being another, so many others, some of which clearly are necessary with a workforce where you've now got female participation at the record highs, which is a good thing because you're not wasting education. But it has to be paid for. And of course, some suggest the way to make Australia a better country is to increase taxation or to, shall I say, change taxation. Many of those ideas come out of our federal treasury. So it might be appropriate, therefore, that we go to somebody from Treasury or formerly from Treasury. David Pearl was the Assistant Secretary at Treasury. He's an economist and now a full-time writer and commentator. Made very strong comments in the media earlier this week, and so I'll move it across to David Pearl. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross, and to Sky for televising this, and Matt Canavan, whose brainchild this event was. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's meeting. In contrast to the stage-managed, confected event the government is holding in this building, as Matt says, this promises to be a worthwhile, frank and transparent discussion of ideas where the Australian people can see and hear and reflect on what we're talking about today. I'll talk today a little bit about the whole of economy dimension of productivity because I'm conscious that we have outstanding sectoral experts in the room. And I also want to talk a little bit about the institutions, the economic institutions that played such an important role in previous economic reforms. As you all know, only last week the Reserve Bank downgraded its medium-term productivity growth assumption by 30% from 1 to 0.7%. And if realised, this will cap our economy's sustainable speed limit to a paltry 2% each year. Yet even this write-down remains wildly optimistic, given that, as you all know, labour productivity has flatlined in this country since 2016. Now, is Australia's poor productivity performance unique in the rich world? Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese and even Treasury would like you to believe that's true. Now, while it's not unique, the slow-growth Western European economies find themselves in a deep malaise like us. Let's not forget that only a few decades ago we were streets ahead of them. In the late 1990s, labour productivity grew at an annual rate of 2.3% each year in this country. We were back then a truly exceptional pro-growth, pro-aspiration economy where markets, not bureaucrats, allocated resources, governments lived within their means and believed in cutting taxes, and where the vulnerable were looked after with targeted, means-tested safety nets. It was a time when both major parties channelled Milton Friedman, but with a social conscience. But we've had a spectacular fall from economic grace. If we continue along this trajectory, Paul Keating's Banana Republic prophecy will be realised, and far sooner than we think. The first step in resting this slide is to correctly identify the nature of the problem. I wrote about problem definitions influencing policy in the Australian on the weekend. That plays an enormous role in Treasury and around cabinet tables, as some of you would know. You define the problem, you get your favoured solution. But let's look at this and be really clear, and let's dispense with the myths and misconceptions some of those at the government's round table are putting out there. Our productivity crisis cannot be blamed on measurement errors in the care economy. It cannot be blamed on the slow uptake of technological advances or progressive economists' favourite bogeyman, malign oligopolies which undermine competition and dynamism. That ideological anti-big end of town view was a late 19th century, early 20th century view. It's now fashionable again. It's fallen out of fashion in the US, but the Australian econocrats and many left-wing think tanks, including E61 and Grattan, still perpetuate it. And nor can we attribute our fall from economic grace simplistically to low business investment, although I accept that's part of the issue. For productivity, as Matt and I discussed the other day, it's the quality, not the quantity of investment that matters. It's the return it yields determined by markets and prices, not bureaucrats. And that's an element of productivity people forget about it. It's the value your accumulated factors generate, not output per se. The Soviet Union had enormous productivity producing combine harvesters, but it had no value. The truth is that we have deliberately chosen the economic purgatory we inhabit. I want to say that again. We've deliberately chosen it. It's not an act of God. It's not an accident. It's not due to the 24-hour media cycle and gutless politicians. We chose it as a society. In the early part of this century, we dispensed with the world-leading economic model Hawke, Keating, Howard and Costello championed and set out to replace it with something entirely different. While this new dispensation was billed as a progressive one, it is in fact deeply and obviously regressive. It's not new, it's not untested, it's something we've seen before and which manifestly has failed, and it has failed wherever it's been tried. It's a revival of failed policies and fraudulent economic beliefs of our pre-reform era, but with shiny new labels attached. Back then, the rallying cry was protection for all, justifying an economy-wide network of tariffs, quotas, subsidies and price rigging. Today, we impose those very same policies under the banner of net zero. Back then, in the area of workplace relations, we're reliving the bad old 70s, as you all know, where unions dictate the terms, including in the government's round table, and multi-enterprise bargaining is back in vogue. And channelling Gough Whitlam, we have removed all fiscal constraints on government, something that Phil Lowe talked about yesterday, embracing unaffordable universal welfare programs and sneering, including in Treasury and including some recent Treasury secretaries, I might add, sneering at the notion of balanced budgets. Both major parties are equally to blame for this, but I can date the Labor Party's loss of its economic conscience. In 1996, the newly minted opposition leader Kim Beazley appeared on the cover of the Business Review Weekly. You might remember that now defunct magazine. He was beaming, and one of his advisors was Wayne Swan. And the headline of that magazine said, "Keating is dead. Labor's new guard rejects his faith in free markets." You can date the Labor Party's loss of its economic good sense then. Unfortunately, while Howard continued the reform tradition, at least in the first part of his administration, and I think Tony Abbott had good intentions, both major parties, and I want to stress this, both major parties are to blame for our economic retreat. Both have embraced the discredited, regressive, but they call progressive, economic prescriptions from the past, not least in the last election. So how do we turn the corner? It starts by posing a simple question. What kind of society and economy do we want to be? Do we want to be a high taxation, cradle-to-grave welfare economy where resources are allocated by bureaucrats, not markets, and growth is deliberately constrained under the rallying cry of net zero, which is a rationing of economic growth? Any honest Treasury person or environmental campaigner would accept that. You ration emissions, you ration growth. There's no breakthrough silver bullet technological solution. The other choice, do we want to be a pro-growth, aspirational economy where markets guided by consumers occupy centre stage and with government playing a critical role but a secondary and supportive one, setting the rules of the game, helping those who are genuinely in need? As I have argued before, this is not a narrow technocratic choice. It's not a case of politicians deciding for one or the other. It's a societal choice. And in fact, it requires considering our social contract. What's our notion of fairness? In the 80s and 90s, the notion of fairness was equality of opportunity. If you were born in the western suburbs of Sydney and had a good education, you would benefit from low marginal tax rates. And if you were successful and ended up in the eastern suburbs, in the Paul Keating and John Howard's Australia, you were celebrated. It wasn't seen as a zero-sum game, as some kind of extraction of value and lifestyle from other people. But today, our notion of fairness is equality of outcomes, which means massive government redistribution. It can't mean anything else than that. How much faith do we have in bureaucrats and policymakers? Do we take a sceptical view of those who regulate our economy and accept that they have their own interests? They want bigger powers, they want bigger budgets, they like to manipulate their politicians, or do we think that they are unimpeachable public servants who are omniscient and omnipotent? I think in Australia, more than any other Western country, and I've lived in France and Britain and the US, we have a very naive view of bureaucrats and regulators. We're going to talk about red tape later with Daniel and his colleague, but to me that's the root cause. And we have to be very clear on that, and the public has to understand that as well. Let me say a few words before I wind up. I'm conscious of the time, about the role of our economic institutions, including the Treasury, where I worked for 2 decades, and the Productivity Commission. The reform task Hawke and Howard faced would have been far more difficult, if not impossible, without the sound advice, credible analysis and professional integrity of these bodies. While the Treasury is not and never has been independent of government, it never hesitated back then to tell ministers what they needed to know rather than what they wanted to hear. We prided ourselves on our whole of economy focus and consistently advocated in private discussions with ministers, both Labor and Coalition, for lower and flatter income taxes, balanced budgets, targeted safety nets, free trade and undistorted markets. We're informed not by ideology, but rational economics and common sense. Over recent decades, both institutions have been colonised, and I use that word advisedly, and compromised by progressive economic ideology, just as so many of our institutions have. The rot started at the top, not at the working level. The discussion papers these bodies issued for the Reform Roundtable lacked economic rigour and spruiked highly questionable government policies and accomplishments. In her press club speech, Danielle Wood, the chair of the PC, called on the political class to adopt a growth mindset and be aware of inescapable policy trade-offs, yet ignored net zero energy policies completely we have imposed on ourselves, even describing it as an economic prize. High on the to-do list for our next reforming government, Labor or Coalition, must be a complete overhaul of these institutions. Let me end on a more optimistic note. While the task of overturning a failed economic is a daunting one, we succeeded in doing it before. Let's not forget that. Policy revolutions must start somewhere, however, as we discovered in 1983 when Bob Hawke floated the Donna. You've got to rip the Band-Aid off and hope that that creates momentum. What are the achievable initial steps that can be taken, while not silver bullets in themselves, but might build momentum for wider changes? Now, this is not meant to be sounding glib. I've thought about this, and it doesn't exhaust other possibilities. First, the pernicious practice of bracket creep must be outlawed, which not only is a regressive tax, but guarantees lazy governments additional revenue every year, feeding the Canberra beast. I spent 20 years in Treasury. Treasury as a revenue department loves bracket creep. Second, in order to fund needed significant income tax cuts, and let's take Paul Keating's 37% or 38% top marginal rate as a benchmark, federal spending must be reduced by 4 percentage points of GDP, just as Paul Keating achieved in the late 1980s. We can phase in the changes, but it has to be linked to meaningful tax cuts or it does not have public support. A much more targeted NDIS should be the first cab off the rank. Maybe it needs to be closed to new members and grandfathered, and its eligibility has to be wound right back to profound disabilities. Third, just as Keating deregulated our financial system, we must do the same to our centrally planned energy market. I'm not ignoring industrial relations, but I think the energy market is the burning platform, and Aidan's going to talk about that. Freeing ourselves from the pointless economic straitjacket of net zero and unlocking the supply potential of our economy. I was at the OECD in the late 90s and we discussed climate change policy, and we all agreed around the table that cutting emissions is an imposed economic cost. The idea of international agreements was to share that cost equally. The Paris Accord, unlike Kyoto, has no credible mechanism, no mechanism at all to enforce reduction targets, and 60% of GDP are not on board. So if you're concerned about climate change, the rational response is adaptation. If we know one thing about the government's roundtable, and I've gone over and I'm going to stop here, Ross, but this is my last thought, it is that it will seek to take us in the opposite direction, serving only to deepen our productivity malaise. Paul Kelly this morning said that the government's progressive economic agenda was an experiment and it'll be judged on whether it succeeds or it fails. I respectfully disagree with him. It's not an experiment. It's a reversion to something the facts show failed in the past. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. Rightio. So we move along now, and in this case, we go to, of all places, Vietnam, where we find Henry Ergas, who formerly was, of course, an economist with the OECD, worked with them in Paris. He was responsible for structural adjustment issues and was a counsellor for microeconomic issues and policies in the economics department there. He's written on so many things in the Australian newspaper, among them, and, of course, has also looked in the past at infrastructure economics in particular. So Henry Ergas is on the line right now. Come on in, Henry. I think we can all hear you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Matt, for organising this and inviting me. I really wanted to touch on 3 issues, some of which have already been canvassed, so I hope you'll excuse me if I do that. The first issue, you could perhaps call it a benefit of age, if there are any benefits of age. And in this case, the benefit of age is that I lived through the energy price shocks of the 1970s, and at the time was quite involved with looking at the impact of those energy price shocks on the OECD economies. And what was very clear was that the energy price shocks of the mid and then late 1970s had, amongst other things, a devastating impact on investment levels, capital stock, and productivity. And that was really because they had 3 effects which played themselves out in the early 1980s. So the first effect was that they led to the accelerated scrapping and decommissioning of otherwise highly productive, energy-intensive plant and equipment. And so the capital stock, the effective capital stock, shrank very quickly in the wake of the energy price shocks, and that reduced output and productivity. The second effect the energy price shocks had, which was equally significant, was that they reduced capacity utilization throughout the private sector. And they did so essentially because the cost of utilizing capacity increased, and so the optimal level of capacity utilization declined. And with the decline in capacity utilization, you had foregone economies of scale, which also had an effect on productivity levels and productivity growth. And the third factor that was at work as a result of the energy price shocks was that the effective cost of introducing new plant and equipment increased because obviously new plant and equipment, when it's put to use, requires energy, and energy had become more expensive. In other words, there was a complementarity, as we economists say, between capital and energy, and that complementarity of energy and capital meant that the overall impact of the energy shocks on investment was very, very material. And in fact, if you look at what happened in that period of the late 1970s and 1980s, because the energy price shock affected virtually every economy, every advanced economy in particular, we had a correlated decline in investment and productivity. And it was only really subsequent to that, when energy prices reverted towards more normal levels, assisted in the United States in particular by the deregulation of natural gas, that productivity levels and growth rates recovered. And so we had what economists call a natural experiment, which showed very starkly the effect of energy prices on productivity levels and growth rates. And of course, in Australia, what we've done is we've administered, as have the other advanced economies, and this too is a correlated shock, we've administered a very large price increase in the energy sector. In Australia, electricity and gas costs as an input into manufacturing have risen by about 85 to 90% over the last 15 years, which makes them comparable to the energy price shocks globally of the 1970s, and hence, as you'd expect, our productivity levels and growth rates have been adversely affected. That brings me to the second point, which was also raised by Gary and David Pearl, which is that, yes, the level of investment matters, but its quality is also crucial. The quality of investment and its composition is every bit as significant as its absolute level. And what we've seen in recent years is a significant deterioration in the quality of investment, particularly in the public sector, and massive growth in public sector investment, most of which would fail any sensible cost-benefit test. And the result of that, of course, is that we not only crowd out private investment, but we reduce the productivity of capital overall. And just to give you one example of that impact, the return on this public sector investment, the NBN, which Labor repeatedly said would earn a commercial rate of return, will, by the end of this year, have taken asset write-downs on its regulatory asset base, which equal the total amount Labor said building the NBN would require. In other words, the total amount that Labor estimated was required to build the NBN has already been written down. Now, the Hilmer reforms, as Gary said, were intended to put that to an end, but what's been put to an end effectively are the Hilmer reforms. That leads me to the third and final point I'd like to make, which is this. Both David and Gary have mentioned the crowding out by public sector growth and the growth in public spending and employment, the crowding out of private sector growth and private sector employment. But I don't think it's only a resource crowding out. In other words, that if a dollar is used for the public sector, well, then that dollar of resources isn't available for the private sector when you're close to or at full employment. Rather, it's also what you could call an attitudinal crowding out. And by that, what I mean is really simply this, is that when 2 out of 3 jobs are created in the public sector broadly defined, then you don't only affect directly the resources available for the private sector, you also affect the expectations and culture of workplaces, because they are set in a competitive economy they will be set by the expectations and culture of public sector workplaces or of public sector funded workplaces. And what we're seeing throughout the Australian economy is the unrestrained growth of an adversarial workplace culture, which is dominated by expectations of entitlements, the right to disconnect, the right to work from home, the right to be treated with kid gloves at all times, the right to sue one's employer whenever any of those expectations is disappointed, all of which compounds the rigidities which are already introduced by our industrial relations system. And with the entrenchment of those entitlements in the public sector, making the private sector less attractive as a source of employment, and especially making small businesses less attractive, that compounds the decline in the private sector. It makes small business creation slower and less successful or less likely to succeed, which makes it overall harder to maintain competition and economic dynamism. Let me just make one last point, if I may, which is this. I think every generation has a policy variable that it faces as a choice, okay? Or an economic outcome that it faces as a choice. And those of you who are old enough will remember Ted Evans saying many years ago when he was Treasury Secretary that unemployment was a policy decision. In Australia, unemployment, he said, was a policy decision. And nowadays, productivity is the economic outcome that is an outcome of choice, an outcome that policy in many, many ways shapes and controls. And that's really the fundamental fact we have to grapple with. It's a great pity that we don't have for productivity the range of terms that we have for inflation. As some of you may know, economists talk about price stability, creeping inflation, galloping inflation, and then hyperinflation. Okay? Well, we should have those terms for productivity, but what we've done is gone in reverse. We've gone from galloping or hyper productivity growth to galloping, to creeping, to stable, and now to disproductivity, which is the equivalent of disinflation. And the only way we'll get out of it is by making the sort of policy choices that Gary and David have so eloquently outlined. Thank you very much.
Henry Garcia, thank you very much for that. You're with a special broadcast on Sky News around the country from the committee rooms inside Parliament House, Canberra. And the reason for this is really as an alternative roundtable, one which is broadcast, to the roundtable taking place by the government, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister holding theirs in secret, no mobile phones either. This one is an open discussion which will be taking place. Before we do move to that open discussion, I do want to bring in one more speaker, if that is okay. And that person is the former chair of not only the ABC, but also of Deutsche Bank and the ASX. Maurice Newman is one of Australia's leading business people, now involved in a range of different matters, perhaps not the least of which is the National Father's Day Committee, which I kind of thought was rather an interesting and productive use of his time. We've got more people coming into the room now. We'll certainly go to them once we've heard from Maurice. But Maurice, thank you so much for being with us.
Many thanks, Ross. And could I say again, as everyone else agrees, this is a wonderful initiative, Matt, so thank you. When I was trying to collect my thoughts as to what I was going to say today, I thought if this was to be held in Ireland, in Dublin, that Senator O'Canavan would be thinking in his introductory remarks, Well, I'm not sure I'd be wanting to start from where we are. But we are where we are, and unsurprisingly, you're going to hear the same themes repeated, but I make no apology for that because I think they bear repeating. I should say that after 50 years of so-called social democratic reforms, Australians are now less free, less equal, less productive, and they're more divided. Indeed, notwithstanding the profound technological changes that have occurred over the past 60 years, productivity growth is where it was 60 years ago. And what's more, homelessness is at a 25-year high, and the decline in real per capita household disposable income has been amongst the worst in the advanced world. Meanwhile, Australians wait for someone to expose the emperors who have no clothes. Sadly, Treasurer Jim Chalmers is one such emperor. Dr. Chalmers promotes Chinese-style socialism under the banner stakeholder capitalism. His mastery of spin uses the title humanising capital, but the philosophy, is the same. Dr. Chalmers believes that businesses should be judged on their corporate social responsibility, not just financial metrics. He advocates, quote, the transformation of the welfare state into a managerial utopia with the government in collaboration with superannuation funds acting as benevolent resource allocators through which autocratic, technocratic elites will manage all aspects of society. What could possibly go wrong? And that means there will be more naked emperors. Clearly, central planning is his utopian ideal. It champions horizontal fiscal equalisation, which encourages states like Victoria and Tasmania to be handsomely compensated for bad policy through federal tax redistribution. This consolidates the power of the government collective, and I think begs the question that we need more states to inject some competitive tension into our nation. Naturally, smaller government, market-driven resource allocation, more flexible employment and environmental laws, and a reduction in immigration levels are off the table in the unproductive roundtable which is occurring down below. But like it or not, productivity is about living standards per person. And I think we should bear in mind that declining education standards play a role here, as well as increasing levels of unskilled immigration, making the task of productivity improvement even more difficult to achieve. So too, the size of government. It's not well understood there are 2.6 million public servants at federal, state and local government in this country. And they have nothing, that has very little to do, if anything, with productivity. And like their mission to employ more, their mission is essentially to employ more public servants, to undermine business efficiency by extending sustainability obligations, drafting DEI legal requirements, and even, I'm hearing, pondering laws to penalise pedestrians who fail to walk on the left-hand side of the footpath. Now, both major parties ignore international competitive. They support renewable energy policies which in just 20 years, as we've already heard, have turned the nation's electricity prices from one of the world's cheapest to amongst the most expensive. So I think we can forget data centres. Futile net zero 2050 targets do nothing for the planet, but they do limit productivity growth, they encourage rent seekers, and they distort efficient capital allocation. And with so many friction costs, Australia is experiencing a record number of business closures, particularly among small and medium-sized enterprises, and none of that should surprise anyone. Nevertheless, despite all, Australia's productivity growth, slow though it is, has been greatly assisted by an increasing participation rate and favourable terms of trade. But those tailwinds are now starting to abate. Participation rates are probably at their peak. I think it's hard to see there will be more women entering the workforce to materially change that. And Australia's terms of trades have also benefited greatly from the enormous decade, or from the past 4 decades really, of enormous growth out of China. But Beijing now faces extraordinary and intractable, in my view, social and economic problems which are the predictable consequence of the system's authoritarian rigidities. And as China's growth declines, so too its demand for natural resources. And that will have a direct impact on Australian producers receiving lower prices, and ultimately that will reflect its way into declining GDP growth, putting additional pressure on stretched government budgets and welfare payments. Now, for too long, all Australian governments have hoped for the best rather than prepare for the predictable. And that's why the company tax rate has gone from being amongst the lowest in the OECD to the second highest. It's also why personal marginal tax rates are comparatively high and kick in at relatively low levels. Payroll taxes remain a barrier to employment. Now, with moderating tailwinds, foreign investors are viewing Australia as becoming too risky. Japanese and Korean investors are increasingly of that view. And we've seen US firms like Kraft Heinz and Chevron selling out. Now, particularly concerning, I think, is the stark decline in Australian R&D over the past 15 years. It represents only 1.66% of GDP, which is well below the OECD average of 2.7%. And it's a poor omen for productivity and for future generations who will bear that cost. I think we can all conclude that the evidence is in. And while Dr. Chalmers' economic reform roundtable, quote, aims to build a consensus on ways to improve productivity, economic resilience and strengthen budget stability, end of quote, given the mindset of many of the chosen participants, it is unlikely to do more than to kick the productivity can down the road. So I think having identified the issues, the problems, that gives us at least a roadmap as to how to go about solutions. But any sustainable lift in productivity will have to await the time when it is politically profitable for the right or the wrong people to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Morris. Really appreciate that. So here we are in the roundtable, the alternative roundtable, as it were, the real productivity roundtable as compared with downstairs. Just out of that downstairs productivity and economic roundtable, Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Treasurer, joins us now. Ted, many thanks for your time. You've heard some of the conversation, in particular, just arrived while Morris was chatting here. Some of the things we've heard already are measures that should be taken from David Poole. Abandon bracket creep. It should be basically abolished to improve productivity. Federal government spending should be reduced by 4 percentage points of GDP. Number 3 was basically with the NDIS, to basically limit the number of new entrants to only those who with profound disabilities. And number 4 was basically to scrap the net zero aspirations of this nation as a whole. So there's some of the actual things that we have heard today as real solutions to Australia's productivity crisis. Tell me what you're hearing downstairs. Are those sort of ideas being thrown about the place?
Ross, no. I think the key thing from those first 3 you mentioned are absolutely key to where the real problem lies, and that is the government has to stop the spending spree. Because if it doesn't, then it's going to only go after more taxes, and the only tax they're really relying on is income tax increases. That's entirely what they think is going to close the gap of the deficits. So we'll find out tomorrow, which is the day that the other round table we'll be discussing taxes, what the government's approach is to that. When it comes to issues of energy, it has been raised, but I've shared this with the other round table, so I'll share it here. My concern is they are defining the wrong problem to solve. The problem to solve is not to accelerate the rollout of a failed energy policy. Because that's what they're focused on. They're trying to get skills, development and capital to accelerate the rollout of an energy policy which is making Australians poorer our economy weaker, industries collapsing. That is not the problem to solve. The problem to solve is how we ensure we've got the cheapest, most reliable grid possible, as we do decarbonise. But they're not talking about that. And I think that's a big difference from the summary, at least, Ross, that you've just provided now.
All right, so we've got to a point now where we can really throw it open to the table. But what I really do want to have coming back my way are points like David Pearl made. In other words, what are the things that need to be done? I think we've identified the problems. I think everybody understands what the problems are. Lack of economic growth, too much government spending, energy prices that are way too high, taxes that are way too high, all of these things, and an industrial relations system that is becoming increasingly less flexible. So my point is, they're the problems. We understand what they are. What are the solutions? Go if you like. Nick Cater, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Sky. Thank you, Matt, for organising this. Would pick up on something Ted said and Henry on this thing about capital formation. So, Henry, you very eloquently drew the link between the energy price shocks of the 1970s and the decline in the capital stock. I wonder if now things are considerably worse because the current government, has taken on such a large responsibility in the allocation of that capital, or perhaps I should say the misallocation of that capital. It's going, as Ted points out, to a very unproductive use, and one that in fact lowers productivity by pushing energy prices up still further. So to put that in simple terms, is a strong recommendation we should make to end subsidies in every form.
There you go. So there is one. I want to go now to Mike Newman, who's on the line in Japan, I understand. Gingavale Investments, the founder of that, been in investment banking for more than a couple of decades, and was also a senior trade and investment commissioner for North Asia for the New South Wales government. Mike, I think you're on the line right now, so I hope we can hear you. There we go. There we go. I think we're trying to get him on the line right now. So we're just trying to get him right now.
How's that?
We've got you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Senator Canavan, for this opportunity to participate. I've lived in Japan for 25 years. I've had an association for over 4 decades, and in that time, this is the first time I've heard Japanese corporations mention the word sovereign risk. That has never happened before. They really have looked at us as such a safe pair of hands. But I think when you look at the retroactive application of the safeguard mechanism and even ever more onerous regulations around red tape, green tape, black tape, and so on, they see that as a disincentive for business investment. Now, even though our Chevron CEO, Mike Wirth, said the other day that Australia is becoming no longer really investable, several months prior to that, the senior vice president of JERA, one of Japan's largest LNG businesses, Mr. Nishizawa, said that unless Australia addresses its onerous regulatory frameworks, they'll have no choice but to look elsewhere from 2030. Now, apart from the words themselves, culturally, you need to understand that the Japanese are very, very polite people who rarely express their opinions this openly. So in some respects, this voicing of frustration should be seen as a DEFCON 2. It's worth noting also that the Japanese and the Koreans run all of their energy transition out of their economic development agencies, METI and MOTI. The environmental agencies play absolutely no part because the government realises that unless you have industry leading the charge, that you are not going to have a very successful economy. And having said that, we only have to look at the very recent Fraser Institute Global Mining Attractiveness Survey, which came out, I think, a couple of weeks back. And my state of New South Wales, despite mentioning this many years ago to the departments responsible, that our programs and whatnot were simply not sending the right signals of intent, we have fallen from rank 27 to 63rd behind the Congo, Zimbabwe, and the Ivory Coast. So, in summary, just to sum up, also the Koreans, who share pretty much almost a carbon copy economies in terms of being resource poor, both KEPCO, Korea's largest generation company, 85% of their power is driven by that, and also POSCO, the steel company, they had ambitions to mine Hume for coal. They were strung out by the New South Wales government for the better part of a decade, all to be not granted mining licences, which cost them $1.2 billion combined. So they have said to me basically that they don't think we're serious, we lack the hunger spirit, and as much as we might see in the press about the Mogami frigates, which obviously is a positive event, deep down, the Japanese and Koreans are not looking at Australia with the same, I guess, love and affection that they have over the past few decades. And I think that's something we really need to be aware of. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate that very much. I just want to ask one question to Gary Banks as we go through this into our next phase. The government right now, as you know, has stepped in with the South Australian government to rescue the Whyalla Steelworks. It's also rescued Rex, the airline. It, on top of that, has also come in and has got Nearstar, another sort of foundry metals business which is there. It seems as though the aluminium smelters are all really at the government's door as well. What role has the government got in protecting these businesses or not protecting them? What is the rational view about government support, government subsidy? You mentioned about some of the things that they have supported, solar panels, a quantum computing business, different things like that. But what is the role in basically propping up businesses which appear otherwise to be uncompetitive?
Well, Ross, if you live long enough in the public policy world, you see things repeat themselves. And what we're seeing with those subsidies to compensate for excessive costs imposed by regulation is a repeat, really, of the tariff compensation game that was played right through in my early career, I guess, where high tariffs impose burdens on firms that needed to be offset with tariffs in turn or subsidies. And so I suppose a slightly glib but probably the right answer to your question is you have to address the problem at its core. And the core of the problem is what is driving these companies to the wall or making them uneconomic or uncompetitive. So we hear a lot of talk about productivity, but it's linked to competitiveness is not talked about as much as it used to be. And so what we're observing is firms that can't compete anymore because their costs have gone up, either because of energy or because of industrial relations arrangements that make it hard for them to do what they need to do. So once you're in that dilemma, I mean, we're at a situation where we're trying to lift our economy up by the bootstraps with lead in the saddlebags, if I can cross all my metaphors. You know, it's a very difficult thing to do, and I can't see it working this time, and it didn't work last time.
Well, I'll tell you, we'll go to a practical example here. The managing director and the founder of ABEC Group, Peter Angelico, is with us here in the room as well, president of the South East Melbourne Manufacturers Alliance. You've just heard this. The issue is that your members, in many cases, because of energy prices, because of wages, because of even taxes, are hurting. They're struggling to survive in many cases. But there are answers for what you need.
Well, the political reality is nothing's going to happen much for 3 or 6 years. Let's be brutally honest about that. So I think this can be driven from the SME world. Now, we've got big manufacturers like Nissan, we've got Hilton Manufacturing, they employ 300 or 400, you've got Jayco Caravans, and we've got the SMEs. So I think that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. Big companies don't innovate. The corporate world don't innovate. So this is where I think we can use the SME world to, you know, how do we power the economy? You know, we're the ones who employ people. I think there's something like 84% of employees are employed by companies of less than 20 people. So we get ignored. And I think there's got to be 2 policy settings. We've got the big end of town, the corporates, that's fine. They're big enough to look after themselves. SMEs, we're a different animal. And I think we need different policy settings.
Okay, so what exactly is it you want, though? What are the policies that you want coming out of it? What's that?
Leave it, stay out of our way. We're happy to innovate, we're happy to invest and grow, and we've got to skill people up. There's a massive skill shortage, so that's one big problem at the moment. The immigration, I'm trying to get a couple of guys in from South Africa on very highly skilled fabricators. It's going to take me 6 months, yet other people seem to get here, you know, on a whim. So that doesn't help. We do have a massive skill shortage. There's a lot of welders and fabricators, I think 20,000 short. There's, you know, you look at the rail, you look at defence, even infrastructure. There's 20, 30 years of work ahead of us. But how do we get a big piece of that pie instead of importing it all?
It's a good point. Thank you so much, Peter. I now want to go to Gerard Holland, who is with the Page Research Centre, Chief Executive there. Gerard, we've heard a lot around the room so far. the point is we want answers. What are the policy settings that Australia needs right now, in your opinion?
Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you, Matt, and thank you for all the contributors. I find myself in furious agreement with what's been said so far. At the Page Research Centre, we're particularly concerned with rural and regional Australia. We are very much a regionally integrated economy. The vast majority of our export value comes from the regions, and chances are if you grow it, if you dig it up out of the ground, if you come to visit it, if you package it, if you transport it out, it comes from the bush. And the two biggest issues, as we've heard multiple times, are energy and the red, green and black tape that's strangling productivity. On what do we actually do about this? Well, we actually do know how to produce cheap energy. We've known for a very long time. We've known since the Industrial Revolution, and it's investing in dense, reliable, dispatchable energy generation, preferably utilising your own domestic abundance of resources, and then situating those generators as either close to the consumer or as close to the mine mouth as possible. We're going to have an energy section later on today, but it's no wonder why our energy prices have gotten so expensive. We are building out a diffuse, disparate, expensive grid that requires exceptional amounts of infrastructure in order to service the economy, and not just the transmission lines. You think about all the roads, all the fabrication, blasting off tops of mountainsides in order to set these things up. That's an expensive game. So what do you do about it? We need to end all these subsidies to unproductive and uneconomically viable renewable projects and transition back towards traditional power generation, which has given us our prosperity in the past. On the red, green and black tape front, we've heard as well that we have some of the highest corporate taxes and company taxes in the world. That's an easy lever to pull, but we also shouldn't be directing funds towards bodies such as environmental defenders offices, which are deliberately frustrating projects and frustrating our primary and secondary industries as they are trying to get things up and going in the bush. I'd just like to quickly pick up on 2 points that David made and that Gary made. David, you mentioned an aspirational economy, and I'm might be the youngest person in this room, and I'm someone who has never seen an aspirational economy in my adult life. Well, I've spent the last 10 years now in a stagnant economy, and I'm looking around at a lot of my peers who are now entering their 30s. They're looking to start families, they're looking to have children, and they're finding they can't afford any property. They've never seen the kind of dynamism and growth that will give them hope for the future. And so, of course, the public sector is an incredibly attractive proposal because it's a de-risked, long-term track pathway which gives them security. And so this, just to make a point that this is a crucially important problem that we realise, and some of that aspiration isn't always a policy lever. Sometimes it's about the way we talk about ourselves. It's whether we see the possible, whether we are seeking productivity, and whether our cultural ambitions are to do things like decarbonise, or our cultural ambitions are to have an aspirational abundance mindset, to think how can we empower the most people to both transform their lives but also equip us to steward the natural environment. And the last quick point I pick up on was the quality of the capital. And you can spend a lot of money building golden statues of Albanese, but that isn't necessarily going to get us out of our productivity slump. And when we're thinking about manufacturing in our secondary industries, I'm acutely aware that the international environment is deteriorating quite quickly. And I think our supply chain security and our national security is an important factor into that equation as well. And you will find a greater alignment in matching up the quality of our capital investments with securing our nation's future, and be that in looking at things like making sure that we continue to have a sovereign shipping industry and an international merchant marine, be that making sure we can do things like make cans, which can then turn into gun and bullet factories should bad things happen, investing in our energy security, and of course in the bush and our regions, making sure we can feed ourselves and our food security, be that our crop protection products, our fertilisers and those other inputs that are necessary to feed the country. So solutions, I think net zero is a good one. Invest in dense power, cut back the regulation, and make sure we are directing capital towards those industries that are going to make sure we maintain our national security and sovereignty into the future.
The other person I want to bring to this conversation, another ex-Treasury official, Jean Tunney. Jean, basically you've heard a lot around the room today. You know how glacially slowly some of these things move. Just one observation that I've made to some people in the past. The next election, next federal election, is approximately 30 months away. Go backwards, 20 months is when basically we saw generative artificial intelligence started by ChatGPT, and yet we see the speed with which that has basically overtaken industry. The question is about the slowness of the reaction of decision making from the concept or the ideas that might happen downstairs or here to the implementation is one of the issues about the lack of speed of decision making in Australia's economy.
Well, yes, but it doesn't need to be. I mean, we need that sense of urgency. Both David and I have probably taken part in processes where governments have moved incredibly quickly, where there is that sense of urgency, such as during the financial crisis when there was a real sort of sense that we needed to act. I mean, there's debates about whether we acted the right way, but clearly, I mean, we acted very speedily. I think government, from what I've seen, government moves with two speeds. There's a glacial. It's when it's too hard. It's in the too hard basket. They can't do the work to get the coalition together. And I think the problem we have is that we had a generation, though, on both sides of politics of exceptional people. We had Hawke, Keating, and Howard and Costello, who were just brilliant at being able to tell the reform story and be able to get all the different parties together. I think we're lacking that now, and it could be the 24/7 media cycle. I don't know, but yeah, it's just a different world we're in now, Ross. But there's nothing to stop governments moving quickly if they have the sense of urgency and can create the momentum for change.
So it's going to be interesting because one of the issues I think we all agree on, and I think it was Maurice Newman who said, well, unless you have cheap energy, you can forget data centres, which then raises the other questions about even your sovereign capability to protect your own data, which is really vital, there's no doubt. So I now want to go to basically have a little bit of a chat about energy, and I think this is the next phase that we go to, because we said we would basically use one part of this conversation to really talk about energy. So I want to bring in, from the Centre of Independent Studies, Aidan Morrison, Director of Energy Research at the Centre for Independent Studies, who's leading research into energy systems from an Australian perspective and the most economical and viable means to transition to a low-carbon economy, which incorporates full system cost analysis and modelling as well. We flew up together this morning, Aidan. We had a bit of a chat about some of these things, but I'll hand it over to you, and then we've got other people who are energy specific in this room, and so we'll bring them in after this this introduction.
Thanks very much, Ross, and thank you, Matt, for putting on this excellent event. I'd like to bounce off some earlier remarks that have, I think, framed this conversation very well. And one question is the allocation of capital. Is it allocated by markets? And also, is it just a question of allocating capital, or is it to do with, and how much of it, but the quality and where that is allocated? And I would say, to conclude that thought, allocating capital is not what produces increases productivity. It is the output from the capital, not the act of making the investment. It is whether you get to produce something more valuable than what it costs to build the productive assets. That is what raises productivity, and that is the tide that lifts all boats in our economy. And so what I want to do today is to cast as a couple of absolutes that we have now no doubt about, things that have been growing suspicions, very, very strong suspicions to many people in this room about what is happening in our energy system at the moment. First is, markets are not allocating any capital to the current energy transition as planned. This is something that I've been trying to argue in many online debates for some time, trying to find which particular projects in developing wind and solar proceeded without government subsidies. But now we have, a week or two ago, finally Ross Garnaut admitted that there are basically none that are proceeding without government subsidies from one level or another. And as well, the Nelson Review into the national electricity market has also concluded and produced a brilliant graphic that shows there have been no investments without substantial government support for a number of years in renewable energy. So markets are not choosing to allocate anything to this at all. We can be confident now that every investment in the current energy transition is going to be driven by state subsidies. Second one is, and I'd like to spend my time elaborating on this, is that the cost of the energy we are producing now, we know for certain, is going to be higher than the cost we had in the past and higher than the cost we have today. And it is simply completely contradictory to talk about developing low-cost or affordable electricity in the current pathway we have claimed towards net zero using very, very high penetrations of renewable energy. So I'd like to address briefly how we have got that so backwards, because it is still a dominant narrative to suggest there is some economic gain to be produced through our current energy plan. It is now crystal clear there is only economic loss. We are producing the same thing at a higher cost, which is the precise inverse of electricity. Firstly, we have been terribly badly served by the Australian energy market operator and their production of the integrated system plan and the rhetoric surrounding it. we hear quotes like this from Daniel Westerman on the official YouTube channel, June 27, 2024. As with previous reports, this plan shows that the lowest cost path for secure and reliable electricity is from renewable energy, connected with transmission and distribution, supported by batteries and pumped hydro, and backed up by gas power generation. So he's made that statement. The lowest cost pathway is renewables, plus, 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 plus. However, we also know that that document is constrained to accept all government policies as being an accomplished outcome. So there is actually no other horse in the race. And this is something that was demonstrated explicitly clearly in the Energy Planning Regulation in Australia Senate inquiry late last year. And in fact, this culminated in a statement, again from Daniel Westerman, which should be known by everyone. The ISP is not a tool to evaluate government policy. It is a tool to say what needs to be delivered in order for that government policy to succeed. So Australians have been utterly duped into thinking this was a multi-horse race and we've found the least cost, when in fact what it was is simply saying what is required for the government's chosen horse to win, and they have made no effort at all to actually assess what the cost is. And the depth to which we have been deceived, I think, is portrayed perfectly well by comments of Matt Keane made in this Parliament on the 4th of November. And he's described what I think is the common perception. That Daniel Westerman did say it's the lowest cost pathway, to which Senator Ross Cadell replied he did within those constraints, which is correct. And Keane says, no, not within the constraints, it was compared to the counterfactual. And of course, the counterfactual is completely constrained by all the same government constraints. So if a former energy minister with the resources of a department can be so completely and utterly misled, how great is the disservice that has been done to the general public at large for us to think that there has been a comparison made, when in fact this was railroading us to a single conclusion. I'd now like to turn briefly to CSIRO's Gen Cost report. And there are a number of issues that could be raised here, but I'd like to focus on their integrated cost of renewable energy, because this is, I think, the one that describes, in particular, the 2024 current day plan to reach 90% penetration, which is where, by all accounts, the government is trying to take us. This is the first time that the CSIRO has been forced to admit that one of their numbers shows that renewable energy is not the least cost. And in fact, it was shown that black coal at their lower bound of $111 per megawatt hour is lower than the lower bound of variable renewable energy at 90% penetration, 125. That should be the headline that was announced, that they've now admitted and backflipped that renewables are not the cheapest, but they still persisted in maintaining this narrative. But I'd like to dissect why we can be confident that that is actually not a narrative that we can have any hope in being defended at all. And that's because there is a little known but I think extremely important reference piece, at least for wind energy, that's been produced. And that's because a recent wind farm that's been trying to get approval, called the Hills of Gold wind farm in the area of New England, actually did a detailed public cost analysis and exercise because they wanted to reinstate a number of their wind turbines which were opposed initially by the department because of the high social and environmental impact of those wind turbines. They wanted to reinstate that, so they opened their books to us and explained why they needed to have such a big wind farm with 62 6-megawatt turbines in order to make their economics work. Their costs, if they only had the initially recommended turbines, were going to be $126 per megawatt hour for wind before you've done any firming, before you've done any transmission, before you've built any synchronous condensers, which is the very, very, very upper bound of what GenCost considered possible for wind energy before you added firming, and is well in the range of what they thought energy would be once you have delivered all of that. But the comment that's really crucial is from the expert panel that was stood up, this new quango called the Independent Expert Advisory Panel on the Energy Transition. They were asked, is this just a high-cost wind farm, by the department? And the comment they made was this: many of the easiest, i.e. most favourable sites in New South Wales have already been developed. Hence, the pipeline of remaining sites all have less than ideal conditions in one or more respects. Now, the capacity factor for this wind turbine that was volunteered is around 32% from this particular site. And they would have had 20% lower capacity factor if they actually only built the turbines that were in the places that were initially approved. So we are already well below what CSIRO has marked as the very worst circumstances, all right? So we're talking about actually looking at the upper bound of CSIRO's integrated cost as being our starting point, which is $176 per megawatt hour of integrated firm renewables. Now, just finally to wrap up with a few comments on how we integrate and firm those renewables, because if you thought that dollar figure at $176 looked bad, we are still accepting in that CSIRO have done everything right about the degree of firming required. First, we should acknowledge they've now moved their estimated range of integration costs from initially $42 to $48, that was 6 months ago, now they're at $48 to $64. And that includes about 10 megawatts for spillage, and we think they still include the assumption that hydrogen will be able to soak up most of the sunlight with 15 gigawatts built in the future. They have estimated something like $30 for transmission, but this was released before the final conclusion that VNI West is blown out by something like 100%. The cost for transmission could yet double again. Also, they've announced that it's about $1.9 per megawatt hour for the synchronous condensers, all right? However, in the recent Transgrid, New South Wales transmission company, their regulatory documents show that they're only going to build half the number of required synchronous condensers because they hope batteries will be able to make up the rest using developmental new inverter technology. So that could double at least as well. Storage at $17.5 per megawatt hour is about the same as their previous draft. But yet, I don't think they've incorporated comments from Alex Wanhass, all right, current board member of Energy Co, rolling out the Energy Transition New South Wales, former EGM, Executive General Manager of AEMO for System Design, former Managing Director for Energy Resources of Oricon, that provides the technical report to CSIRO, former Executive Director of CSIRO for their Environment, Energy and Resources program, someone who knows his stuff, has estimated at Energy Week earlier this year that the amount of storage from batteries will have to roughly double from what's estimated in the Integrated System Plan. So storage could double, synchronous condensers should double, transmission might yet double, spillage we've no idea about, and they haven't included anything for the gas firming and peaker capacity because they assume the system we currently have in 2024 will still be available and free to an investor. So I would put it to you that now there is no chance at all the system we are currently building is going to fall anywhere short of $200 per megawatt hour, and any claims to the alternative to say that we are going to be having cheaper or affordable energy relative to anything we now know can be summarily dismissed. They are simply not intellectually credible. Thank you very much. I think it's just important that we understand that we are now driving ourselves with taxpayer dollars to a less productive energy system and pushing our energy costs north of anything we have currently seen.
Aidan, thank you so much for that, and that sets the scene. I want to bring in your colleague now, Zoe Hilton, the Centre for Independent Studies. Zoe, you've done a fair bit of work on this also. The question is just the impact on industry, the impact on Australia's productivity, the impact long-term on Australia's economic growth.
What we're seeing the government do right now is pour billions and billions of taxpayer dollars into undispatchable capacity, unreliable energy in the form of wind and solar and batteries. And that is the opposite of what we need to be doing. That is just going to waste everyone's money because we're going to be having wind and solar energy that appears when it feels like it and not when we want it. And we're going to be having very expensive batteries coming into the grid. We also see all of these home battery subsidies that the government is rolling out. And that's just going to increase total system costs. And when you increase total system costs, you increase electricity bills for everyone. And then that really impacts industry. It makes it completely unaffordable for heavy industry that relies on cheap energy prices to stay in our country. And so what we really need to be doing is we need to focus on dense energy and reliable dispatchable capacity. So really, if the government cared about reducing energy prices and keeping industry here and keeping electricity prices cheaper for consumers, then they would be focusing on, firstly, refurbishing our current existing coal plants and looking at trying to build new coal units on existing coal plant sites. And then in the medium term, looking to build new coal plants or potentially nuclear plants as well in the medium term to ensure that we have cheap, affordable prices going forward. But they don't seem interested in that. In the CSIRO's Gen Cost report, they don't look at refurbishing. They don't look at building new units on existing sites. They don't look at even building new coal plants with the same sorts of designs we built in the past. They only look at building these advanced ultra supercritical plants at unprecedented steam pressures and temperatures that no one in the world has built anywhere. And so they've completely ignored the obvious short-term solutions that we can do that is pretty much the only way at this point that we can have any hope in preventing further bill increases, or at least limiting the bill increases, and hopefully eventually bringing the electricity prices down to what we have seen in the past, where we've had cheap energy prices that have been able to grow the industry that we have had historically.
Zoe, thank you so much for that. I want to bring in here now Nick Jorce, who is the founding managing director of Stanmore Resources, a coal mining business. Nick, thanks for being with us today. Is that business simply too hard now? You just heard there just suggestions about what could potentially be done, and again to create more cheap electricity in Australia. But the reality is, under the current government, is that horse bolted? Is it too hard to be in the coal mining industry these days?
Oh, it's definitely tough, and I think look, I'm very pleased to be here as a representative of the industry that now produces the cheapest energy in Australia, according to the CSIRO. But I think we are being sort of strangled by red tape. We're being taxed out of existence as an industry. BHP just came out with their results yesterday, and their BHP Mitsubishi BMA business in Queensland, on my maths, lost over $1 million a day in Queensland coal mining in the last 6 months. They paid around, I think, $1.3 billion in royalties to the state over the last 12 months.
And they're some of the best coal mines in the world. They're the metallurgical coal mines going off to China in particular, Japan, Korea for steelmaking is what that coal's used for.
Yeah, some of the highest quality coal in Queensland, which is a high quality coal jurisdiction and dominates the seaborne market into those Asian countries and beyond. So they've come out and said that their effective tax rate, including royalties, is 67%. In my case, I'm still the chairman of Bowen Coking Coal, which is a small producer. We were producing 2 million tonnes a year, still producing a little bit. That tragically went into administration a couple of weeks ago. And one of the major issues, it was a very efficient mine. It was one of the lowest cost mines in the Bowen Basin. But we paid $120 million in state royalties before we made our first profit. So it turned out not to be a business, it turned out to be a charity. And that becomes not very fun after a while. So, but I take Aidan's point and Zoe's point, and I think there is absolutely a path for coal going forward. Coal demand, we can't forget, continues to rise. So every year the naysayers say it's going to peak, and every year it continues to rise. It is the lowest cost form of energy, and it's really heartening to see the numbers come through that support that. I mean, Coal Australia did a report which we put into the Gen Cost review, showing that you could produce electricity on a new ultra supercritical coal-fired power plant at between $50 and $70 a megawatt hour. So that's exactly half the cost of electricity as it was in the NEM last year on average, about $125 a megawatt hour. And it's a far cry from what Aidan's talking about, going to $200 a megawatt hour as we continue to drive our costs up with intermittent, unreliable.
So you're saying that coal in Australia could definitely and should still have a future to drive down energy prices?
On an economic basis, absolutely, it should, and it should be driving our prosperity. It is the cheapest form of energy we have, and the reason, and I was a bit too young to remember, so I get that one in, but the reason we didn't go nuclear in the 70s after those oil shocks was because we had all this cheap coal. There were a number of protests from the nuclear space as well for the Greens, but we had hundreds of years of cheap coal, and we still do. So Victoria, for instance, had cheap gas and cheap coal. They had all the manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing in Victoria. That's now shutting or shut on the back of the fact that they've stopped exploring for and producing gas, and they're closing down their power stations with the Yallourn to follow in a couple of years' time. When that happens, the lights go out in Victoria. Queensland is blessed with the youngest coal fleet, and we're still producing power out of Queensland coal power stations for sub $50 a megawatt hour. Even in Victoria, they're producing it for $30 a megawatt hour. So this is a fraction of what we're paying today, let alone what we'll be paying in the future. So I would absolutely suggest that we need to have a serious conversation there. The other thing in terms of solutions, and you're looking for solutions, if the government would just take the foot off the neck of our productive industries, and I include not just mining, I include agriculture, I include construction, and also include manufacturing on that. So mining and most of those industries don't actually look for subsidies. We're not looking for a free kick. We're paying a tremendous amount of tax. We're looking for a reasonable sort of tax load that doesn't tax us out of existence. The reallocation of that wealth that comes from our industry and other industries and goes into things like renewables that are unproductive, that's what's causing the problems here. So I think the numbers are around $8 billion a year potentially in subsidies, going up now with the capacity investment scheme for renewables. We are pumping billions of dollars into the government coffers as a very productive industry, the mining industry, and it's getting ripped out and put into an unproductive industry which is only there because of the subsidies. You take the subsidies away, you take the intermittent power and the renewables away.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I want to bring in here Alex Underwood. Alex, you're with Beetaloo Energy, and I spoke with Meg O'Neill, the Chief Executive of Woodside, yesterday. It's interesting to note that the Environment Minister, when he came into power, basically said, Murray Watt, that the expansion of the North West Shelf project, which has been something like 8-9 years in the offing, basically waiting approvals, which the state government's approved, but the federal government hasn't yet given its approval. He would greenlight it and fast-track it. 11 weeks later, there is still no approval, and yet they want to go ahead with a 40-year project. You're in Beetaloo, and obviously Beetaloo is a key basin, a key area for the east coast of Australia to have sufficient gas. What sort of barriers need to be taken out of your way to be able to bring that gas to the east coast market and bring down energy prices?
Yeah, so as you said, the Beetaloo Basin is one of the largest gas deposits in the world and certainly the largest in Australia. The North West Shelf itself, I think, has been an incredible economic blessing for our country for the last 40 years. It's contributed around 2% to our total GDP throughout that period. And, I strongly believe that North West Shelf project should be extended because it's providing energy security for the entire region. The Beetaloo, in fact, is many multiples the size of the North West Shelf. Various estimates state that it contains between 500 trillion and even up to a quadrillion cubic feet of gas, which could power Australia for hundreds of years. And I think if you look at the US experience with shale gas, and this is a shale gas basin, the United States economy, in my opinion, has been largely underwritten by the shale gas industry over the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, the US gas prices were around double or even more than they are today. Every time a hurricane went through the Gulf of Mexico and gas production was shut in, you'd see prices take off, whereas the shale gas industry has given them some of the cheapest energy in the world. The US has gone from being an energy importer to now one of the world's largest LNG exporters, and we have that same opportunity here in Australia. The Beetaloo has the potential to be one of the lowest cost sources of gas in Australia, and as we've seen in various programs like Chris Ullman's Real Cost of Net Zero, getting down that marginal cost of gas is going to have a direct impact on the cost of electricity. We have a very supportive Northern Territory government who are actively pushing the development of this basin, and we are strong believers in, first of all, supplying the Northern Territory market. They don't have coal-fired power in the Territory, and so we will be selling our gas to the NT government initially, but we do need to get more gas into the East Coast market. We've seen gas prices on our East Coast go through the roof in recent years. The Bass Strait is declining, and that really underwrote the manufacturing heartland of Victoria for decades. And so what we need is, first of all, streamlined approvals. We cannot have the situation like you're seeing with the North West Shelf, where that extension has now been going through an approval process for 6 years. We need those faster approvals because ultimately, while our company has primarily been financed by Australian investors, to really see the Beetaloo Basin fully developed, we are going to require foreign investment. And, you know, it is concerning to hear that our partners in trading partners in Japan are concerned about investing in Australia. We're also going to need to see further infrastructure development. So there are currently there's some pipeline connectivity into Australia's east coast from the Northern Territory, but it's relatively limited. And it's my opinion that, you know, truly nation-building infrastructure should include building much larger pipelines to connect this enormous resource into Australia's east coast so that we can help to bring down prices.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Matt, you know, we've got a hard out at 11:30 as we head to the Bush Summit in Broome today with Sky News. But I just want to bring you in terms of some of the practical ways in which productivity can be improved in Australia, that economic growth can be improved in Australia. For that is a way in which we can start to pay for some of the social programs of the government, like the NDIS and other things. But we just need some economic growth, and for that we need productivity improvements. What have you heard today so far?
Well, thank you, Ross. Thanks again for hosting it. And look, I suppose in terms of providing those ideas, I'm really just going to summarise the great minds and discussions that we had today. I want to thank you all. I think it has been a very good format to have these longer form discussions that I think people are crying out for. There's an appetite for it, so thank you for broadcasting that. I mean, I'm happy to take other suggestions from the floor, but a few that I heard, and I suppose at the top of the list, is the need to reduce government spending. I mean, if you look at the numbers, you look at the budget papers, the last budget before COVID, hit the budget in 2018-19, the federal government spent $477 billion a year. A lot of money, But wait for it, 7 years later, in this financial year, we're due to spend $778 billion a year. It's gone up by just a touch over $300 billion. Every year, we're spending $300 billion every year extra than we did just 7 years ago. And that's a big figure, hard for people to comprehend, but there are 10 million odd, a little bit more than 10 million households in Australia. That's $30,000 extra per household. And I don't think the Australian people think that they're getting $30,000 extra. Can you imagine if your council put your rates up by $30,000? They wouldn't be lasting it to the next council meeting. But that's what the federal government has done, and have done so somewhat under the radar. So that's got to happen. In terms of how we do that practically, we had some ideas. But the ones we've really focused on here is, I think, the energy situation. I know we didn't get a chance to hear from the IPA, but we will later. They've done excellent work showing that about $10 billion a year is now spent just on subsidising energy. So I think that's a big idea of getting rid of those energy subsidies, letting the market work again. Another thing on the energy debate that has dominated today is the removing both the legislative and the artificial bans on energy production in this country. There is a definite restriction on nuclear power. It's in this place. And there is a de facto ban on coal-fired power. We're almost not allowed to mention it anymore. But as Nick has said and Aidan said, going through the numbers, it's very clear now, even from the CSIRO's work, that the cheapest form of energy production in this country remains our access to some of the best coal reserves in the world. So why would we limit ourselves using that when we export it to the rest of the world? I should have mentioned too the outlawing bracket creep. I think that's another one, a way of starving the beast and making sure we don't get another $300 billion increase in the next few years. And finally, the issue of net zero has come up a few times. I obviously think it should go. At the very least, there needs to be a proper assessment on what I think we discussed today about the costs of this. And that's what hasn't happened in that other secret round table below. They've effectively accepted these emission reduction targets as something that does not need to be costed. As Henry Ergas wrote the other day, that somehow the success of our emission reduction policies are now not connected to the benefits that they might produce. It's like any sacrifice we make should be done. So I really want to thank people again. Thank you again for broadcasting it. And there's a lot of ideas here.
Very good. So thank you so much for all being here as this part of it. A special broadcast by Sky News to really appreciate the issues of our economy, what's holding it back, and some of the issues that might actually make it move faster in the future. Now, we thank very much Matt Canavan for bringing everybody together in this room and outside the room as well. Many people watching this. And so, as I say, Sky News has broadcast this across its various platforms, and obviously there will be replays there as well.